I'm going to record this one. I'm going to post them both. CPU stuff is in here, which isn't on chapter 4, but I didn't modify the whole PowerPoint just for that. Okay, so we're going to go through the stuff on motherboards. These are the objectives, which aren't as important as what we need to make sure we get from it. First of all, before I start talking about the motherboard on the slides, the motherboard is the first thing that we choose when we're setting up and making our PC. We talked about in chapter 1 that everything has to be connected to the motherboard. So the motherboard is really our nervous system. If we wanted to equate it to the human body, it's what connects everything together. The CPU is our brain. The motherboard's our nervous system. If it's not connected to the motherboard, it doesn't work. Okay? So that when we first pick our motherboard, we're defining the size and shape and general component makeup of our PC. In other words, we're deciding what did I just say the definition of? The size and shape is it's on the tip of your tongue, I see it, the form factor, okay? So the motherboard decides the initial form factor of our PC. Of our poor PC, which defines the size and shape of all the components that follow. When I pick my motherboard, I'm deciding what CPUs I can put in it by the socket that's there. Okay? So if I put in an LGA socket, if I choose a motherboard with an LGA socket, I'm really choosing an Intel processor along with that for my motherboard. If I decide one that's a PGA socket, and this is a generality, I'm really choosing, most likely, an AMD. Because I may have ASUS as my motherboard manufacturer, but there's only two CPU manufacturers, and that's Intel and AMD. And that initial decision on my motherboard decides a whole bunch of other things for me. Okay? Decides what kind of power supply I need, what kind of CPU I need, what kind of memory I'm going to put in there, what kind of cases it will fit in. So when I make that initial motherboard choice, I'm deciding the form factor for a whole lot of other things that follow. Okay? Now I just said that the motherboard is our nervous system. It's what connects everything else together. Okay, if I've got a really good brain or a really good CPU, but I've got a really crappy motherboard that's really slow, I'm really doing a disservice to that really good CPU. So when I look at motherboards, I have to look at the speeds of my motherboard, okay? And one of the things you guys all kind of missed was the motherboard bus speed. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But in general, if I can't find it somewhere else, the motherboard syncs to the memory. Okay? So the last one that TJ just showed us, overclocked to 3,000 megahertz, or went as low as 1033 megahertz. Okay, that's my variation in speed that motherboard can handle. It's a huge variation. It's a third slower. So if I put the slow cheap memory in and it syncs up to that, my motherboard is 3 times slower than it would have been if I overclocked it with the fastest memory that particular gaming motherboard took. Okay? And if I have a CPU that's working at 4.2 gigahertz, and I put in memory that works at 1033, I've just made the motherboard talk 4 times slower than the CPU does. Okay? So those are things to consider when I'm adding all my components in my computer. Now I may not be able to afford this, but if I can afford 1600 over 1033, I need to realize that that's going to impact how my motherboard and my CPU and everything else talk. Okay? So you can't just say, I'm buying this PC with this, and then I'm going to chintz out on everything else, because it really would be better to buy a cheaper 3.2 gigahertz and get better memory so that the whole system runs faster. Okay, because my PC is not defined by one speed, it's defined by a whole bunch of things. But my motherboard is my first piece in that puzzle. Okay? I went too far, didn't I? Okay, so when I look at my motherboard, it determines the types and speeds of CPU that I can use in it. It determines what chipsets on the motherboard. And when he went through, he talked about the north chipset and the south chipset. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It determines what kind of memory I can put in my PC. Does it take DDR2? Does it take DDR3? What kind of DDR3 does it take? Your gamer motherboard was way faster, could take way better memory than his basic integrated home PC motherboard could, which is what you want, okay, right? It determines the number and types of expansion slots on there. Do I have PCI X16s? Do I have PCI X1s? Do I have PCIs? How many do I have? How many do I need? I can't add those later. It's got to be part of the motherboard when I buy it. I already said the type of memory and determines the type of case. I may be saying, and we said this, that we're going to look at all ATX, but there's mini, there's micro, there's regular ATX. What cases can those fit in? Okay? All those things are determined by that initial choice of what motherboard that we choose. Okay? When I look at a motherboard, I need to be able to know. In fact, I'm going to skip ahead a couple pictures just because I want a more current one. I need to be able to know just from looking at a lot of stuff. Okay? The first thing I need to know is what kind of CPU goes in it. Okay? There's going to be questions in the test. And I just give you a picture of a motherboard and say, most likely this takes a what processor. Okay? Now, I see it on here. Okay, it says AM2. AM2 means it takes what process, what manufacturer? AMD, because AMDs are AM2 current ones, AM2 plus and AM3 sockets, and they all look exactly the same when I look at them. And they're all PGA, or pin grid array. In other words, they have holes, and the CPU itself has pins on it, like this AMD. Stab myself, like this AMD does, okay? It means it has pins on it. This is a really old 386 processor. So it has pins, and it goes into a socket called a ZIF socket, or a zero insertion force socket, meaning that if you line the pins all up, if I didn't just bend them when I dropped it on the floor, which I could have easily done, let's see if I did. Oh my gosh, I've done a couple of them. I have to try to bend those back because I like using this when it's a nice. I'll have to try to fix it. Anyways, it should drop straight in there. It did. Look at that one right there. See that one in the corner right there? That's it. Good. Caught right there. Okay, anyway, so it takes a PGA or pin grid array socket just by looking at that. It's got the single lever arm right there that I just covered over with my pen. Okay, so that's a AMD with a PGA socket. Okay, I should be able to look at that. Now the rest of it, after I do that, is independent of whether it's a PGA or an LGA. The memory's the memory. It takes, in this case, DDR2. I've got how many slots? Memory? That's a question I'm going to ask. How many memory sticks can I put in this PC? I can put in 4. Should I assume from looking at this that it takes dual or single channel memory? It takes dual. Why would I assume it takes dual?
Two slots.
Because there's two what? Because there's 2 colors. That's why they color code them differently. Okay? Because they want you to know that you put the orange ones together and then you put the green ones together. Otherwise, they'd all be the same color. Okay? So I can assume normally if there's 2 different colors of memory slots that it takes dual channel. Okay? Now this one's an oddball because the oranges are together and the greens are together. Normally they're separate, like this one. So that you put the yellows together and the reds together. Why are they separate? Why would I want them separate? And not right next to each other, up against each other. Because of heat. Okay? If I was only going to put 2 sticks of really good memory in here, and I put them right next to each other, it's going to cause a lot more heat than if I put them separated and had an air spacing. Okay? So I should be able to identify the memory. When I look at this, I should be able to say, and I should be able to ask, Corey, how many PCI X1 slots are on this motherboard? And there are two. They're the little tiny ones right there, okay? And if I said how many PCI slots are on this motherboard, Haley, what would the answer to that one be? 3. All 3 of those are PCI. This is a weird one. Almost never are PCI slots colored. They're almost always just that cream color, like this one is. Almost always just cream. And usually PCI 1s are this dark brown color and they're hard to pick out. But that's why this one's up here, because it's not oddball, so I thought I would make sure you know that just because it's normal doesn't mean it's always that way. So this has 3 normal PCIs, and these last 2 could be PCI X16s or PCI 8s. There's no way from looking without looking at the specs to know. Okay, because PCI 8 and PCI 16s physically look the same. Now I would guess, when there's only 2, that they're both 16s. I would guess that. Normally, if it's a new motherboard, at least the one closest to the CPU is going to be a PCI X16, because that's the best one for your video card. Okay. So on this one, what kind of socket do I have on this one? Okay, I have an Intel because it's LGA, which stands for Land Grid Array. It's the one that has little dots on there. It usually has a hook. Sometimes it's not a hook, but usually it looks like that when it's LGA. Once I've gotten past the CPU and know that it takes Intel, again, we're back to the memory for this one could very well be the same memory for this one. Just because this is an AMD processor and this one takes an Intel processor doesn't mean they both don't take the same kind of DDR memory. They could. This doesn't drive this. This drives this, okay? And this one, in this case, this is a gigabyte motherboard, and this one is a, I don't even know, I didn't put it on there, okay? So other things that we should know, when I'm looking at this motherboard, and I say, where do I plug in the power? Where do I plug in the power, Haley? That's not a very good pointy. Somewhere on there. Okay, where do I plug in the power? Right here is my P1 connector. How many volts is my P1 connector? Guarantee that'll be on the final. There's my P1 connector, and that is 3.3 volts. Okay, is that the only power that I plug in on the motherboard? Where's the other one? Where is it? You're right. It's almost always near the CPU, and there it is right there. Okay. How many volts is that one? There's only 3 volts, and you've guessed 2 of them. 12. Okay. That one's a 12 volt P4 connector. Okay. Now, it's called the P4 connector. It doesn't always just have 4. Sometimes it has 8. Okay. Some of them have an 8-pin connector that goes in there instead of a 4-pin connector. And usually the 8-pin connectors are on AMD motherboards. I don't know if this one has it or not. It does not. Actually, this one takes a regular Molex 12 volt connector on that one. Okay, so I've got those 2. So if I ask where the power connectors were, you got that one there and you got that one there. Then I would connect to the motherboard. This one's the 3.3 volt. That one's the 12 volt. Okay. How many SATA connectors do I have on this motherboard? SATA being the hard drive connectors that plug into this cable right here. Okay? Are you counting those 2 right there? Because I also have these 4 right here. The answer is 6. Okay? They look like this. They have a little hook thing on them. If you look at the end of that, you can see the little L hook on the end of that cable. Pins right there. Okay, that's the SATA connector. So when you're going through your motherboard specs and you're saying, this many SATA, that's what it looks like on this motherboard. And we're going to show TJ's motherboard and show you they can look different too. Okay, so I should be able to ask you how many SATA connectors on the motherboard, and you just look and say, oh, that's the little L connector. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. Why are these different colors than those? Do you think? Because they go different speeds. Okay, and on his he had some that were 6 gigabits per second, and some that were 3 gigabits per second, and they color them differently so that you know which one's which. Now, I can't tell you, I'm looking at this, which one's which, without looking at the specs on the motherboard and saying, oh, it had this many of this one and this many of this one. So when I look at, we're going to go back to, here's your gamer. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this gamer motherboard. And this is what I was saying. See how these are turned sideways. His are all the same color because they're all 6 gigabits per second, okay? But they're turned sideways, so how many do I have on this motherboard? 4 pairs. They're always in pairs. So there's actually 8 on this motherboard because each one of these is 2, 2, 2, and 2, and we might be able to see it on a different picture. I have no idea if they actually show. Nope, they're pointing the other way. I don't think you have any pointing that direction at all. No, you don't. So you might look at it and think there's only 4, but they're always in pairs, just like in this one. Zoom out. Where they are up and down. These are pairs here too. So I've never seen an odd number. They always are even numbers. Okay. So this only have 3 gigabits per second connectors. They're slower, but it was your home one, which is fine. Okay, and so there's 6 here. And like I said, they're always even, and those go straight up. So if I looked at the specs on this one, I am sure, down here to the specs, that it's going to say that there are 8. There's 2 that are run by an Intel controller. And there are 2 that are run by an AS Media controller. I don't know why they have 2 different hardware controllers, but they do. They're all 6 gigabit connectors. Oh, because the Intel ones go together to do your RAID array, which is a way of configuring hard drives. That's why they have. I don't know why they wouldn't all be the one kind, but I guess they're not. I'm going to go back to this picture again, since we're here. Okay, so. Here we've got our different memory, and we can go all the way up. The other thing, your slide said 3,000. This picture may be off. But it goes 2800, 266. These are overclocked all the way down to 1333 on there. There's our good video ports, and they almost always have the locks here on the back of them. It's really hard to see our other PCI ports on this picture until we zoom in. And now we can see the PCI X1s, and this is another, what is this one, an 8? No, it's just another 16. So it has 3, it's no normal PCIs, but it has 3, right? 1, 2, 3 PCI X1s, 2 PCI 3.0 X16s, and a PCI 2.0 X16 down here, but no regular PCIs on that one. Okay. And here's one, and the reason I put up this picture is because you may have seen on your stuff that it was either SLI or Crossfire ready, and you should have seen that on your gamer one. It should have said one of those 2. And what that means is that your cards are at the right spacing to put this little connector cable on there, which connects up 2 high-end video cards to act as one. And depending on whether it's a NVIDIA card or an AMD card, whether it's SLI or Crossfire, and usually if they're ready for one, they're ready for the both. But this makes this work as one super video card. They both have 6-pin power connectors in their back, so they're using extra power. I have a video card on mine that if I don't have an 850 watt power supply on, my computer won't even turn on because this video card sucks so much power on startup. Once it's going, it doesn't, but it won't turn on without a high-end power supply. But that's what SLI ready means. That you can put that connector cable on there or Crossfire and make them work as one. Okay, we talked about our main thing is ATX that we looked at. I also said there was BTX, which really looks like a mirror image of ATX. The difference is that this stuff is over here. So instead of mounting on one side of the case, it mounts on the other side of the case. It's very common commonly used by Dell. It's not commonly used anywhere else. I don't know why Dell uses it. I think it's so that you can't move your Dell stuff into another case. It has to stay in there. Because not many people use BTX. ATX is the most widely used form factor out there. Okay, on the motherboard, we pick our socket, and so we're picking our CPU, and then we pick our chipset. Okay, on our motherboard, we got the CPU, which we said is the brains, right? Central processing unit of the brains. And then we have chipsets that control the flow of information around the motherboard, okay? And we have what's called the north chipset and the south chipset. And on the north chipset, there's some controller, which on TJ's thing, he listed what his north and what his south bridge controller was. The CPU talks to things at a different priority. The north bridge is the stuff that's the fastest, and the CPU wants to hear from all the time. There's only two things that work on the north bridge. What are those two things? If I was going to pick two components that were the most important on there that I needed to talk to all the time, what would those two components be? Give me a guess. What's the most important thing that the CPU talks to all the time? The only place it writes. Memory. Okay? So on the north bridge we have the memory. And what's the second most important thing? Especially if you're a gamer? Video. Okay? So on the north bridge is the video card and the memory. On the south bridge is everything else. Okay? Because this stuff on the north bridge is prioritized. And remember I said when you see a heat sink on the motherboard like this, that's where that controller exists. So when I show you a picture of a motherboard and I have matching and it says which one is the north bridge chipset, if there's only one heat sink, that's it. Okay? So I'm going to go back to TJ's picture. And we're going to hit reset here and go back here. Okay? Now, if I didn't know any better, and it's kind of hard because of the way it's colored, right here I get this big, huge heat sink. If I don't know any better, that's where the north bridge is. If nothing else is labeled, I'm going to say that's the north bridge chipset because it does the most, it manages the most amount of traffic, and it gets heated up the most. Let's see if we've got another one. There's another one. Okay, so I got, this is a better one to look at. I have two heat sinks on my motherboard. Okay, there's my CPU, there's a heat sink, there's a heat sink. Which one's the north and which one's the south? Big one's the north, little one's the south. It doesn't handle as much traffic. The stuff going down here is slow. It doesn't heat up as much. The stuff here is going really fast. The video and the memory it's moving information and a lot of it all the time really, really fast. So that heats up. So the bigger heat sink on your motherboard is your north bridge chipset. Okay? So when we're talking about this, the next conversation then is pen is my bus width. Okay? Things are moving around that bus. And my bus width defines how big the bus is. Okay? So we have two widths in use today. Does anybody know what they are? It's defined in bits.
32 and 64.
There we go, 32 and 64. The new iOS just came out as the first mobile device that could support 64-bit architecture. It means that the packets that move around that bus are twice as big on a 64-bit bus as they are on a 32-bit bus. Okay? And you would say, well, then I always wanted a 64-bit bus, don't I? Maybe. Okay? 32 is still pretty much the standard. And there are reasons that you might want to stay with 32 over 64. Okay? The number one reason is drivers. Okay, drivers are what? Do you remember what the definition of a driver is? It's a program that makes hardware work. Okay? If all the programs you have that make all your hardware work is written for 32-bit, by the way, they're not cross-compatible. This driver doesn't work for that. It has to have a new one. So if all my drivers that I have that are standard right now that are working at home are 32-bit drivers, and I go up and upgrade to 64-bit, will everything work? Not necessarily. Okay? There's a lot of older stuff that all of a sudden just doesn't work anymore. So didn't have 32-bit or didn't have 64-bit drivers right before. Okay, so that's one of the reasons to stay with 32-bit. One of the reasons to go to 64-bit is that right there. There is no 4 GB memory limit. When it comes to 32 bits, no matter how much memory I put in there, it will see 4 gig max. Okay? If I take that computer, and this computer will hold 16 gig of RAM, and I put 16 gig of RAM of that with a 32-bit operating system, it sees 4. That's it. But if I go to 64-bit, it's unlimited. We'll pretend I spelled that right. Unlimited. There we go. Okay? That's a reason you might want to go to 64-bit. That's why our servers are almost all 64-bit, not all of them. Trail 3 that does our print servers is not, because it's got all 32-bit print drivers for all of our 32-bit machines. And if I made it 64-bit, then I would have printer problems. Okay? But if I want to put a bunch of memory in something, I have to go with the 64-bit. Now, the operating system plus the hardware makes that decision. Okay? First of all, the hardware must be 64-bit capable. Not all hardware is. You can't just say, I'm going to 64-bit. Your motherboard has to support 64-bit. Your processor has to support 64-bit. And then you have to put in the operating system that supports it too. So a lot of you at home may have machines that support 64-bit, but you're running Windows 732. And you're running Windows 732 because of this. Oftentimes they make a machine that runs 64-bit just fine. These run 64-bit just fine. Okay? But if the drivers didn't exist, they couldn't put it on there. It wasn't going to work. Dell shipped out laptops that came with Windows 7 64-bit on them, and the stuff inside the laptop didn't work. And to reformat. That's why those are formatted with Windows XP 32-bit. Because they didn't work. The Wi-Fi doesn't work on Windows 7 64-bit. It drops and comes back up as a drive. They don't have the right drivers for it. Even on, and that's Gateway, by the way, not Dell. But so when I'm choosing my motherboard, I have to think about these things too. What am I going to do? Am I going to make it a 32-bit machine? Am I going to make it a 64-bit machine? If I'm going to make a 64-bit machine, how much memory will it take? We didn't set a limit on the motherboard one, on the home one, because we knew we were going to put 32-bit. We knew we can't put more than 4 in it. There's no reason to. We only see that. And if I want to do the gamer one, then I want to be able to put more, because I might want to put that on there too. Okay? Did go too far. Okay, so the motherboard determines the CPU, and we're going to talk more about this. We're going to talk about this next, after Christmas. Okay, I'm not going to get into that and new information right now on CPUs. Okay, it's enough to know that we've got a bunch of different kinds of CPUs. We've got 2 different CPU manufacturers, those being Intel and AMD. Did I just go backwards? There we go. We've got Intel and AMD. The AMDs use PGA, and the Intels use LGA. And the reason that's important during our motherboard is because we need to make sure we get the right socket to match our motherboard, but we'll talk later about how to really make good choices on CPUs themselves as we get into the CPU section. We have to have a good cooling solution on our motherboard that's on our CPU, or the thing is not going to work. In fact, I just made a really nice 8-core server, and I was out of what's called thermal grease. On top of your CPU, when you put in the cooling fan, some CPU fans come with like a black plate of, I'm going to say, grease on the fan, kinda. to keep it cool that seals the fit between the CPU and the motherboard. And then other ones, high-end ones, okay, so like this one has this little black, I don't know what it's made of. It's to replace thermal grease. And so when you put it on the CPU, you can see this one's used, that it sealed around where the CPU was. The other thing that you can use is called thermal grease, which is like gray paste, okay? And you put it on the CPU before you put the heatsink on it. I didn't have any, and I thought it would be good enough. It wasn't. It would run until I put any kind of load on the system, and then it would just shut down because the big huge fan, I have a big huge fan on it, could not keep it cool enough without having thermal grease on the CPU. So we have CPU cooling fans that are important depending on what kind of load we're going to put on our system as well. And we have different kinds of fans on there. I already talked about the different kind of CPUs. We already said that the socket has to match the processor, and we've got Intel and AMD processors. I just talked about what the chipset does. It controls the flow of information around the motherboard. The North Bridge controls how it reads and writes to memory and to the video card, and the South Bridge controls everything else. North Bridge is fast for graphics and the memory controller. The South Bridge is for all other devices work on the South Bridge. I'm not going to look at some of those because I didn't point those out. Okay. So also with the motherboard, we've got our ROM BIOS, our BIOS that comes standard. It's already programmed into the ROM chip when we get it on here. That doesn't mean, even though it's read-only, it doesn't lose itself when we turn off power, it doesn't mean you can't update it. If you've got problems with your motherboard, updating the BIOS sometimes will solve it. I'll give you an example. We did the middle school lab is an AMD lab, and we upgraded to Windows 7 this summer. And we upgraded, they all had 1 gig of RAM, and they all had Windows 7. And this machine said it had a gig, this machine said it had 2 gig, this machine said it had 16 gig, this machine said it had 8 gig, but they all have a gig. And what we ended up finding is that if we updated the BIOS, all of a sudden they all reported the memory right. Because we were putting an operating system on with an older version of BIOS that just weren't talking right. So, and it caused all kinds of problems. So, updating BIOS is it used to be a pain. It used to be really hard. It's fairly easy anymore. If I've got a PC like the ones we're working on right now, which is a Dell Optiplex 960, I can just Google Dell Optiplex 960 BIOS. I can go right to the Dell drivers, and don't stop here, because right now it says, hey, version A5, see other versions, and they're up to A18. And you can see they came out with the original BIOS in 2008, and they did a new one, 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 a new one. We're up to A18. It came out this year. And they come out with new ones because memory gets faster, CPUs get faster, and they need to program the BIOS to work for that newer stuff. If your PC is working fine, I wouldn't recommend necessarily just reflashing the BIOS. But it's really easy. If I go here to the current version A18, all I have to do is download the file and run it. And it will say, are you sure you want to upgrade to this new version A18? And you say yes, it'll reboot, reprogram BIOS, and come back out. After that, you won't even know that you got a new BIOS. Other than it might fix some stability issues. And when I look here, it says, well, what did we fix on this version? And I'm not going to. Okay, so now it works with the Intel MEFW 5.2.71.108 platform. I don't even know what that is, but obviously it wasn't working with it before. Okay, and if I went back to all the other versions, I would be able to see what changes were made as they upgraded and put out new BIOS. And it says follow the instructions really carefully. That is 100% true, because if you screw up programming the BIOS, you can ruin your computer. Don't ever do it with thunderstorm. Don't do it if your power isn't really good. I would recommend, if you have an UPS, having it on the up, so if the power did go out, it would be able to finish it. Okay, because you can mess it up. And those PCs that you might have seen, the motherboards that said they had dual BIOS. Look that up. What's the deal with dual BIOS? It's because one of them is programmable and one of them is not. So that if TJ goes to upgrade his BIOS and screws it up, it goes back to the other one, starts up, and you can put the BIOS back on. So that it basically makes it so you can't screw up your own computer, is the idea there. And there's a bunch of different makers of BIOS, and we've seen this slide before back when we were looking at BIOS back in chapter 2, when we were looking at that, okay? We just talked about the buses, the bus sizes. You know, we started out 4, then we went to 8, then we went to 16, then we went to 32, and now we're going to 64. I don't know that we'll go any bigger than 32 or 64. And really, you know, it sends around this big, huge string of data. The only things that really use 64 is high-end video that needs that big of data packet to process. Most of the time, if you've got 32 and you've got 64, if they both had 4 gig of RAM in them, I don't think you'd see an iota of difference. If you put that on there and say, oh, it's running 64-bit, you're not going to make a difference. However, if you've got 4 gig in this one and 16 gigabytes in this one, okay, you might see a difference. And I still don't know you're going to see a huge difference because not many things use that much memory. You just don't. You might see a difference on a high-end game that you've got on ultra high or whatever. Okay, this graphic just shows the different width of the buses that we've gone through and how much information goes through those. And it shows back down here that USB originally, the bus width was 1, which is why USB used to transfer really, really slowly. But really everything's on 32 and 64 anymore. And this is to show you some of the slots. Of the slots we use, most of them, I'm not going to ask you questions on any one other than those ones that we just went through. You should be able to identify. And these are some graphics that you will see on the test. If I go and throw this out, I'm not going to throw this one picture out because you can see, but you should be able to identify PCX1 versus 16 versus standard PCI. Those are really the only ones that are in current motherboards anyway. This older one, I've got an advanced graphics port, an AGP port here, but you're not going to find a current motherboard that uses anything besides PCI and PCI-X slots anymore. So, but you should be able to identify what those are, and I should be able to throw out a graphic like this, and this is a hard one, but we'll go through this one as well. And I wouldn't have every single one of these, by the way, be matching because, yeah. Because some of these you really wouldn't be. If I ask you A, B, C, D, E, and F, that would be pretty hard. Okay, because you don't have a good view on it. However, A, the thing that's always on this end, and the thing that's always on this end are pretty much standard. The last thing on here is always, can you guess? Audio. Audio is always at the end. So A is going to be our sound ports. Over here, F is almost always going to be our PS2. Okay. But what is B, C, D, and E? I can't ask you that. I mean, I could ask you this if I had this and said, which one is the network card going in? You should be able to pick that. Which one's PS2? I should be able to pick the mouse and the keyboard. Which one's USB? I should be able to point out the USB port, so the VGA port. That I should be able to point out. But from this angle, I wouldn't ask you that. If I ask which letter is the CPU go in? Where does the CPU go? I, yeah. So if I said which one's the CPU, you wanted to match the CPU socket with a letter, that would be I should be able to definitely point that out. If I said which one's the P4 power connector, Haley, it's letter G, right there. Okay, there's my P4 power connector. Corey, if I ask you which one is my P1 power connector, which one's that?
That's on the right side of it.
No, it's down here. The P1 is L right there. Okay. If I ask you, TJ, how many SATA connections do I have? What's my answer? Kind of hard with this graphic. Yep, I got 6. So I got 4 red ones right here, and I got 2, we'll call that brown ones. So I got 6 SATA connectors right there. I have 1 PATA connector. Anybody know which one that is? Right here. It's that P, that red one right there is a PATA connector. It has 40 pins on it, and that's what traditionally we used to use to hook up our hard drives and CD-ROMs. That's the PATA one. And the slightly smaller one over here that's a K is our floppy drive. This has 34 pins, and this has 40 and 40. And used to be, we always had 2 and we always had 1. Now, on the PATAs, you might only have 1 or you might have 0. Okay? Why would I still, if knowing that this is at best a third that speed, why would I still even have one of those on there? Because we have one old device that we still plug into that still doesn't go any faster than the connection. Okay? And why would I make Corey go and buy a new DVD? Because almost all the ones, if you open up your computer, probably is PATA. Why would I make him buy a new one that's SATA? Which, by the way, that's all they sell anymore, SATA ones. I can't even buy a PATA. But these still don't go any faster than that cable, so why do I care? Why would I waste a SATA connection on this when it reads so slow anyway? Because they are. They're really slow. I mean, my hard drives are spinning at 7,500 revolutions per minute, and that's spinning probably the 10th of that. That's why they're still there. Because you might still have an old CD-ROM or a DVD or something that uses that connection. If I said, how many PCI connections do I have? Haley, how many PCI connections do I have? You have 3, right? I have 1, 2, 3. And Corey, if I ask you how many PCI X1s I have, how many do I have? 2. I have 2. That's all I can see is those 2 right there. And if I said how many PCI X16s, I don't know. I don't know if that's a PCI X16. I would not give you 2 and 1 as a choice. I would only give you one of those as a choice. Because you really can't tell. That could be 16, that could be 16, that could be 16, that could be 8. Without looking at the motherboard specs, I have no way of knowing. So if I asked you that question, I wouldn't give you both 1 and 2 as an answer. I would give you one of those, the right one. Because that's kind of a trick question. Because I don't know. Most likely, that's a 16 and that's not. Even though it's the same size, I don't see a latch on the back of it at all. And if there's no latch, it's really not probably a video card connector. That's what I'm talking about, the latch right there. Because all the video cards will have a latch on the back of it. And so I don't see one right there. That looks like the motherboard circuitry underneath there. It does not look like a latch. So I would bet you there's only one PCI X16, that's a PCI X8. And by the way, these, you can plug a PCI 1 into a PCI 16. So if you've got a PCI 1 device, but no PCI 1 ports, but you've got this PCI 8 available, that's why see how those are all in line right there? It will physically fit in there and it will work just fine. Okay, I think I got through everything I wanted to get through. Oh, the chapter, if you read, the textbook's on the webpage, by the way, but if you had read the textbook, it talks about jumpers. There is only one jumper anymore that I ever use at all, and it's generally on a Dell PC. Dell PCs almost always have a jumper that's labeled PWD, and this one is right there, and it's a password jumper. If I pull that off and start the computer, it clears out the BIOS password, and I can't save a BIOS password until I put this jumper back on there. That is the only jumper I ever use anymore. It used to be we had to set jumpers for the speed of the RAM, for the speed of the CPU. All that stuff is detected automatically in BIOS anymore. Only the password jumper do I ever have to mess with anymore on anything. You guys know this, that the battery holds the CMOS memory information that we set in BIOS, and there's a couple picture of jumpers, but again, I don't ever have to set those anymore. Last thing that talked about in the chapter is troubleshooting stuff. We already know that memory makes beeps, okay, from our stuff looking at BIOS. If we hear a bunch of beeps, we can assume that it's probably memory. If we put new things on our motherboard and all of a sudden it doesn't work, take those things off. We'll see if maybe it's just incompatible. And always check your power supply before you go and assume that your motherboard or your CPU is bad, because oftentimes that's what has gone bad first. Okay, and we looked at that before last chapter, the BIOS speed codes. Okay, do you guys have any questions about anything? Now I will tell you that the quiz is really, my intent for the chapter 4 quiz is really to let you see what the questions look like, so that you can ask me questions if you have questions. You're like, I didn't understand that, I didn't know that was what we were going to ask me. That's why we're doing the quiz tomorrow. Because what I don't want to do, and I know this is going to happen probably in some of your classes, is to have the first time you see a question on content be on the final exam. Right? I'm not saying it's going to be the exact same question, but you should at least, in my opinion, have been at least seen what the material's all over.